All right, deep divers ready to dive in. Today we're going back to 1944, right after World War II. Imagine this, delegates from 44 allied nations. They all gather at this huge hotel.
Wow. Well,
Yeah, like nestled in the mountains of New Hampshire.
fancy.
I know, right? But here's the thing. Their job was to rebuild the entire global financial system, like from scratch.
Oh, wow, from the ground up. That's a tall order.
Totally. And
Yeah.
that's what we're diving into today.
I mean, it wasn't just about rebuilding, was it? They were trying to avoid repeating the mistakes that led to the war in the first place.
Exactly, like economic instability being a major factor.
Right.
So how did they tackle that? Where did they even begin?
Well, they knew they had to work together.
Yeah.
So they created these two brand new institutions,
Okay.
the International Monetary Fund, or IMF,
Okay.
and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development.
Which we know as part of the World Bank Group today.
Exactly.
I mean, those names are still so relevant today.
They are.
But what were they actually designed to do back then?
So before World War II, think about it, countries were constantly engaging in these currency wars.
Like manipulating their currencies.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Each one trying to get a leg up on the others.
Which ultimately hurts everyone.
Yeah, it's like a race to the bottom.
And then the Great Depression hits, which was like
Exactly. A huge wake-up.
showing what happens when global cooperation falls apart.
Yeah. So the IMF was created to prevent that kind of crisis from happening again.
Okay, how so?
They could provide short-term loans to countries in trouble. Like if a country was importing way more than they were exporting.
Which can lead to a shortage of foreign currency.
Right. Making it hard to pay for essential imports or even pay off debts.
Makes sense.
So the IMF could step in, give them a loan, and stabilize their economy.
So the IMF was like the emergency fund.
Exactly.
And what about the World Bank? What was their role?
So while the IMF focused on short-term stability, the World Bank was all about the long game.
Okay, the long game.
Reconstruction and development. They funded infrastructure projects, rebuilding what was destroyed in the war, roads, bridges, power systems, things like that.
So getting countries back on their feet.
Yes.
Yes.
And over time, their focus expanded to supporting economic development in general, especially in developing countries.
Like today, we see them involved in education, healthcare, agriculture.
All sorts of things. It's about long-term progress.
So essentially, they were trying to create this more stable and predictable global economy,
Absolutely.
which everyone agreed was crucial for peace and prosperity. But this was like a whole new world order for finance.
You could say that,
Yeah.
but it's important to remember not everyone was happy about it.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Some countries, especially the Soviet Union, saw it as a way for Western powers like the U.S. to basically control everything.
So even with this push for cooperation, there were already underlying tensions.
Yeah.
And the tensions eventually blew up into the Cold War.
Yeah, shaping global politics for decades.
It's amazing how one event can have such a huge ripple effect.
Absolutely.
So we've talked about the goals, but what did this new financial order actually look like?
Yeah.
I know there was something about a gold standard and fixed exchange rates.
Yeah, that was a key part of the Bretton Woods system.
Okay, tell me more.
So instead of currencies constantly fluctuating against each other, they were pegged to the U.S. dollar.
And the U.S. dollar was pegged to gold.
Exactly. Think of it like a restaurant menu. Instead of figuring out how much your meal costs in a foreign currency,
Right.
there's one fixed menu with prices in your own currency. Makes it much simpler.
Right. Definitely takes the guesswork out of things.
Exactly. That was the idea behind fixed exchange rates, to make international finance predictable and easy to understand.
So they were trying to eliminate those wild swings in currency values?
Exactly. Creating stability.
But like any system, there had to be drawbacks, right?
Of course. There were definitely criticisms.
Like what? What were people saying?
Well, some argued that pegging your currency to gold was way too rigid.
How so?
It limited a country's ability to manage its own monetary policy.
Like adjusting interest rates.
Exactly. Those tools they might need to respond to their own economic conditions.
So if a country needed to devalue its currency to boost exports, they couldn't really do that.
It was tough. It's like they were so focused on preventing one type of crisis, the currency wars.
That they might have accidentally created conditions for new problems.
Exactly. And that rigidity eventually contributed to the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system in the 1970s.
Interesting. So it wasn't a perfect system.
Not at all.
Yeah.
But it was a bold experiment.
Before we get to that collapse, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about the International Trade Organization, or ITO.
Right.
It seems like they were going for a trifecta with the IMF, the IBRD, and the ITO all working together.
Yeah, they were. Yeah, the ITO was supposed to be the third piece of the puzzle.
The third pillar.
It's about this new world order.
Right. It was all about creating a level playing field for international trade.
Reducing those barriers that stifle trade, like tariffs and quotas.
Which can lead to conflict.
Absolutely. And economic inefficiencies.
So it sounds like a no-brainer. Free trade benefits everyone, right?
In theory, yeah.
So what happened? Why didn't the ITO ever get off the ground?
Well, it ran into a lot of opposition.
From?
Mainly the United States.
Really? That's surprising.
Yeah, they were the ones who really pushed for the Bretton Woods system in the first place.
Exactly.
But by the late 1940s, the political winds had shifted.
Okay, how so?
Some U.S. lawmakers and business leaders got cold feet.
About?
They worried that the ITO would take away too much power from individual countries.
Meaning?
They wouldn't be able to protect their own industries from foreign competition.
So national sovereignty versus global cooperation.
That's the
And national sovereignty won out in this case.
It did. The ITO never came to be.
But this idea of global trade rules, it didn't just disappear, did it?
No, it didn't. It got channeled into a different path.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or JTT.
JTT, now that rings a bell. It was a less ambitious agreement, right?
Exactly. Not a full-blown international organization like the ITO is supposed to be.
More of a stepping stone.
Yeah, it gave countries a framework for negotiating trade deals and reducing tariffs gradually.
And JT eventually led to the creation of the World Trade Organization, or WTO.
Precisely.
Which is what we have today.
Exactly. The WTO picked up where GATE left off in 1995.
With a broader reach.
Absolutely. It covers trade and goods services, intellectual property, the whole shebang.
And importantly, it has that dispute settlement mechanism. So countries can actually challenge each other's trade practices.
And seek a ruling from a neutral third party.
So even though the ITO failed, its legacy lived on in a way.
It's a fascinating example of how an idea can evolve and adapt over time.
From the ITO to GATT to the WTO.
Exactly. And through it all, this core belief that global trade needs rules, a system to keep things fair and prevent chaos.
This has been fascinating, really eye-opening.
Glad to hear it.
We've gone from the ashes of World War II to the creation of these incredibly powerful institutions.
The IMF, the World Bank, the WTO.
All shaping the global economy today. But as you mentioned earlier, the Bretton Woods system itself wasn't meant to last forever.
Right. Things were bound to change.
So what happened? Why did it fall apart?
Well, there were a few factors at play.
Okay, let's break it down.
One big one was the shifting balance of economic power. Go on. Remember, Bretton Woods was designed when the U.S. was the dominant economic superpower?
Right. The U.S. was in a league of its own.
Exactly. But by the late 1960s, other economies, particularly in Europe and Japan, they'd recovered from the war.
And we're starting to challenge the U.S.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that put a strain on the whole system, particularly those fixed exchange rates.
It's like a game of Jenga. You can pull out a few blocks, but at some point...
The old tower gets wobbly.
Exactly. And on top of that, the U.S. was dealing with its own economic woes.
Right. The Vietnam War was draining resources.
And inflation was rising.
Making it really tough for the U.S. to keep the dollar tied to gold.
Because they were printing more dollars than they had gold to back them up.
Exactly. And that eroded trust in the whole system.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
And it was really only a matter of time. And then in 1971...
Nixon made his move.
Exactly. He took the dollar off the gold standard.
Which basically marked the end of Bretton Woods as we knew it.
It was a seismic shift in global finance.
So the world shifted away from fixed exchange rates towards the system we have today.
Right, where currencies are free to float against each other.
More flexible, but also potentially more volatile.
Exactly. It was a trade-off.
But it seems like it was more about adapting to a changing world.
Absolutely. The global economy had evolved, and the old system just wasn't working anymore.
It wasn't about one system being inherently better or worse than the other.
Exactly. It was about finding a system that worked for the times.
That's a really important insight.
The Bretton Woods system had its flaws, but it was a bold experiment.
And it laid the groundwork for the global economy we have today.
For better or for worse.
Before we wrap up our deep dive into Bretton Woods, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about how some countries, particularly the Soviet Union, were wary of this new world order.
Yeah, they saw it as a power grab by the West.
So how did their absence from the Bretton Woods system play out in the long run?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? They weren't on board with this whole U.S.-led system.
So what do they do?
Well, they went their own way, basically.
Okay.
Created their own separate system,
Like
the Soviet ruble, as the anchor currency.
Instead of the U.S. dollar.
Exactly. And they focused on central planning.
Instead of open markets.
Right. So you had these two competing economic blocs.
Each trying to pull the rest of the world in their direction.
It was a big part of the whole Cold War dynamic.
And how did that impact the global economy?
Well, it created a lot of pressure, especially for developing countries.
In what way?
They were caught in the middle, forced to choose sides or try to walk this tightrope between two very different systems.
So this one event, Bretton Woods, it's got these huge ripple effects.
It's true.
Creating institutions that are still around today.
Like the IMF, the World Bank, the WTO.
But also these geopolitical tensions.
That are still playing out in different ways.
It makes you realize that economics and politics, they're inseparable.
Totally. And it reminds us that these institutions, they're not perfect.
Yeah, they faced a lot of criticism over the years.
Right. Some argue they haven't done enough to help developing countries.
Or that they're too focused on the interests of wealthy nations.
It's a complex legacy with no easy answers.
It's definitely food for thought. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Bretton Woods, what are the key takeaways you want our listeners to walk away with?
Well, first, just the sheer scale of what they accomplished.
Right. Coming together after a world war to rebuild the global financial system.
It was a remarkable act of international cooperation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then there's the lasting impact of the institutions they created.
The IMF, the World Bank, the WTO, they've all played a role in shaping the global economy we have today.
They're not without their flaws, but they represent this ongoing effort to manage the complexities of international finance and trade.
Exactly. And I think the final takeaway is that this story, it's not over.
What do you mean?
I mean, Bretton Woods was a product of its time, right?
Of course.
The world has changed dramatically since 1944.
New challenges, new players.
Exactly. And that means we need to keep asking ourselves, are these institutions still fit for purpose?
Are they adaptable enough to meet the challenges of the 21st century?
It's a conversation that needs to happen and keep happening.
On that note, I want to thank you for being our guide on this deep dive expert speaker.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our deep divers out there, thanks for joining us on this journey through history.
Okay.
Remember, the decisions made at Bretton Woods, they still resonate today. So keep asking those tough questions, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. We'll see you on our next adventure.